for Jazz and Justice. Good morning. Of course, another informative morning with Democracy Now! And up next, in just a few moments, we will have Ethelbert Miller with On the Margin. His guest this morning is Zinga Fraser. So we want to stay tuned for that. And you are in tune to WPFW in Washington.
Welcome to On
Recording
the
in
Welcome to On the Margin with Ethelbert Miller. My guest today is Zinga A. Fraser. Zinga A. Fraser is the editor of Shirley Chisholm in her own words, speeches, and writings. Zinga A. Fraser is assistant professor of Africana Studies and Women's and Gender Studies at Brooklyn College and director of the Shirley Chisholm Project on Brooklyn Women Activism. How are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you?
It's great to have you on this show. There's a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
We go back to November 30th, 2024. We celebrated the 100th birthday of Shirley Chisholm. Your book shows that she was more than the first black woman elected to U.S. Congress or a black woman who decided to run for president of the United States. What might or what might surprise a reader who picks up your book?
I think one of the things that would surprise readers is really the breadth of Chisholm's political ideologies and progressive legislative policies and engagement, right? I think most people think of her as first, but they don't think of her as a political strategist. They don't also think of her as a public intellectual, right? We are trained, in fields to think of intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois and, Anna Julia Cooper, or maybe someone like Toni Morrison, those who, write incessantly, but Chisholm is engaged in an intellectual enterprise during the 1960s and the 1970s. She's influenced by Black feminist intellectuals, Black feminist poets, and so she's reading those people, but she's also writing in publications throughout the 1970s. So I think, the main goal, one of the main goals of writing and compiling all of her, speeches and writings is really to place her in a context of the Black intellectual tradition. And so Chisholm really is a part of that Black intellectual tradition and is a way for us to think and broaden our perspective of her, but also Black political women during her time.
Let me ask you a personal question. How did Shirley Chisholm enter your life? Was it a speech that you saw or a book that you picked up? How did she become so important to you?
I mean, she becomes important to me as a young woman. Well, actually, younger than a woman, right? I was a child. My mother was a medical technologist. She worked in Brooklyn. Shirley Chisholm picketed with her. There is a picture of my mother at the with a number of hospital workers at the National Museum of African American History in DC, right? Ironically. And I had no idea until I went to the exhibit. I'm like, oh my goodness, that's my mother's picture. And of course, she's in the exhibit that we have in New York City. So as a young child, I heard the stories about Shirley Chisholm and who she was. And then as I, got older and I worked, my first job was working for Congressman Major Owens, who took Shirley Chisholm's seats, and coming from her district, I felt like there was really no discussion about Shirley Chisholm. And that was a long time ago. I don't want to date myself. I'm still 25, right? But, I'm literally just getting out of Temple University, having an undergraduate degree in political science and African American studies. And I was really just, interested in why no one spoke about her as much. And coming from her district, there wasn't any kind of semblance of Shirley Chisholm at that time. And then so when I went on to my graduate studies in Columbia, and working on the Congressional Black Caucus specifically in that history, I really found that there was this gap, and it just intrigued me. And it intrigued me because there was so much not known about Chisholm.
Hmm.
And so it's, everyone says I've had an obsession with Chisholm for a very long time because it's, dating back over 17 years now. But she continues to engage me and provide new ways and entryways for me to think about politics, for me to think about immigration, colonialism, intersectionality, all of the things that we're talking about now. And the one of the good parts of the book is that it's divided in all these areas, right? Where we never thought that Chisholm is talking about the environment, right? She's talking
Mhm.
about the prison industrial complex. She's talking about police brutality, all the things that we're talking about in our current moment, in this current state that we're in, Chisholm is talking about in 64 and 68 and
Well,
70.
let's go back. Let's go back to something you just mentioned.
Okay.
Let's talk about your mother, okay?
Yeah.
There must be something that led her to Shirley Chisholm. And then also, did she talk about Shirley Chisholm in the house? That you heard some stories and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, my mother was, uh, God rest her soul, she's been deceased for almost 2 years now. But my mother was an activist from North Carolina, right? She grew up in segregation in Kinston, North Carolina. And she was a member of SNCC, and she, was an activist in her own part. And coming to New York City, you know, the reason why she was connected to Chisholm was because Chisholm was picketing with hospital workers, because there's this all misconception that the North had all of these opportunities that the South didn't happen, right? And my mother and her family, as many other African Americans, especially in New York, come from that great migration, right? They, leave North Carolina, and they, set up shop in New York and Brooklyn at that time. And so my mother was an activist, and a part of what was going on in New York and Brooklyn at that time was a continued effort to ensure that there was no unionization, right? And African Americans understand how unions were so pivotal and important to maintaining a living wage and getting resources and benefits, right? And so that was, some of the things. My father was also an activist and a Black nationalist in New York as well. And so I grew up in a very
Mm,
political savvy engagement as a young child. So
mm,
there was no
mm.
escaping
Right.
books and literature and a discussion about Black history. Black history was 30
Mhm.
365 days, 24 hours in my house. So
Mm.
I had no, there was no escaping that.
Right.
And
Well,
I'm
your house is very different from mine. I grew up in the Bronx, and the only reason why we knew about Shirley Chisholm is because she's from Barbados, and that's where my
okay.
and that's where my
Okay.
mother's family's from. So
Okay.
it was this Bayesian thing going on, and
Yeah.
I want to open the door to that because I want you to talk about Shirley Chisholm's this West Indian background,
Mhm.
specifically Barbados, and you mentioned in the book and the introduction that Shirley Chisholm's father was a follower of Marcus Garvey. And we also hear that when we talk about like Malcolm X's mother, I mean father and mother being from the West Indies. And I
Mhm.
wondered in terms of how that breaks down in terms of what we saw even between Garvey and Du Bois. African Americans and West Indians, that type of thing. And then specifically, I'm from Jamaica, not Barbados, and how that might play out. So that's a lot on you, but talk about that.
No, it's not, because
Okay, flesh out
it's
the
my
early, the early
yeah,
Shirley
and
Chisholm.
I'll talk a lot about Chisholm, but even my own family background. So my grandfather was Marcus Garvey Jr.'s and Julius Garvey's, Marcus Garvey's son's godfather, and my parents are godparents to Sekou Garvey, who's my godbrother. So I'm infinitely um uh, qualified to discuss uh Garvey and Garveyism and those engagements in terms of African Americans and Caribbean, because my grandfather and my grandmother were Jamaican, right?
Mm.
And so,
See, this
um,
is all coming out in this interview.
right, just the luckiness of it, right? The irony of it. Chisholm, and what I talk about in the introduction is Chisholm has a really interesting perspective in terms of migration. So I talked about my mother's family's kind of Great Migration, right? But Chisholm's parents, her father in particular was very influential in terms of her developing her own political identity and her own um, racial pride and understanding of her own Africanness and what that meant to her through Garvey and other Pan-African diasporic influences, right? And so that becomes a really stalwart in terms of Chisholm. Chisholm understands the world through that kind of gaze and that perspective of talking or listening to her father talk to his friends about what was going on in their home countries. And it was only Barbados, but just think about what's going on in the world during during the time in which Chisholm is a child. And what's also ironic about Chisholm and interesting is that she has what I call a reverse migration story, right? We always assume that migration to the United States is the place of milk and honey and opportunities. But Chisholm family understood what was happening during the Depression. And of course, for African or Black African ancestral people in New York City, right? Um, the Depression they were the first hit during the Depression. And so because of the economic issues with the family, right?
Mhm.
During the Depression, her mother sends her and her sisters back to Barbados
Mhm.
for a significant period of time. And so that displacement, just think about it being a child and being displaced from your mother and your father and the home that you knew because of that economic crisis, right?
Mhm.
Of course, they with their grandmother and they didn't feel it in that way, but it still does provide a perspective, right?
And
Um,
you're growing up in Barbados and not Brooklyn.
yes, growing up in Barbados, going to primary school in Barbados, and it's also a certain kind of I wouldn't call superiority, but just having this idea that having a Barbadian education was going to be far advanced and far better, especially elementary education
Mhm.
in Barbados, and what her mother believed that she would receive other than being in Brooklyn, receiving that education. And I would probably agree that Chisholm probably received a better education and being surrounded. I think what we don't pay attention, and there are studies now that saying, having education where your teachers are Black or they coming from their community creates a certain kind of racial pride and all of those other kind of things for not only for self-esteem but also for academic excellence happen in those spaces. And so Chisholm comes out of that landscape of thinking about what diaspora means and
Mhm.
also having a understanding about colonialism and imperialism. So,
Mhm.
while the racism that Chisholm would face and understand in the American context is prevalent, right? Excuse me. What is also under her understanding of colonialism and imperialism. So you will see,
Mhm.
as I say in the introduction, she understood what it meant to be taught the British English, to be taught about the Empire of England, and not be taught about the indigenous people of Barbados and Black
Mhm.
history
Well,
and
let's look at something that you also do in your introduction, which I think is very important, and I want to ask for some clarification on it. Um, you talk about placing Shirley Chisholm within the tradition of the Black feminist intellectual tradition, and so I looked at that, and then I said, okay, Black feminist intellectual traditions. To me, that was one section. But then what about the radical Black feminist intellectual tradition? And I'm thinking of people like Angela Davis, Claudia Jones, even Lorraine Hansberg, which to me, they're a little more radical, you
yeah.
know. And I was wondering whether you might agree with me that there's two Black feminist intellectual traditions.
Yes, I don't make that distinction in the same way, but I do consider, you know, I, um and I think I draw from it a lot. Francis Beale, Claudia Jones,
Right,
like
right.
Even Claudia Jones, who's also has her own connection to the diaspora, right?
Hmm.
They are a part of a kind of Black feminist radical tradition, especially those who are also connected to New York, as well as a larger kind of things about talking about carnival and what that means.
Hmm. And they're actually, in this case, David's, you know, Jones and say Angela Davis, they're in the Communist Party.
Yes, they are, definitely. And you have people like Sonia Sanchez and others, right? Who are, Chisholm is reading. She quotes Frances Bill in a number of her articles as well as speeches, right? And Chisholm is influenced by that radical left, right? Those who are part of the Communist Party, or those who, are more connected to the radicalism, but she's also still very connected and convinced about being a catalyst, right? In the Democratic Party. So, while others in the Communist Party only kind of think about, not necessarily abiding to the Democratic framework, Chisholm is still invested in that. And so, in some ways, she's radical in the ways in which she thinks and her
Hmm.
ideologies, but she's not committed to the same framework in terms of how power is structured in terms of the Communist Party. She's not a member of
Well,
the.
let's look at that. Let's look at because we could say and that when we look at Shirley Chisholm, intellectually we can put her in one group, but then I wonder how much he because he's sort of like grassroots, how much he may have a more linking to say Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, she's influenced, and it's because of Fannie Lou Hamer that she even runs in 1972, right? Without the progression of really making the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party a viable way to rethink and reimagine participatory democracy, right? And that's the kind of work that, Barbara Ransby talks about for Ella Baker, right? She's
Hmm.
definitely influenced by that. She's influenced, like, for example, when we talk about her advocacy for domestic workers, right? If you think about some of the writings of Ella Baker, talking about the Bronx slave trade, right? Literally
Right.
talking about what's happening with domestic workers. So all of these things are, integral in terms of her reimagining and rethinking, but also her lived experience. She knows what it looks like, and she's talked about it incessantly, right? When she's developing these legislative policies, that African American women, in particular, Caribbean women, are the ones who are taking care of who? White people's, children, right? And what does it mean for them to not have resources in terms of everything from childcare, 24 hours? She's advocating for 24-hour childcare. She's advocating for Social Security benefits for domestic workers. And so she's doing all of that during that time that it's, significant. There is a radical left wing that's operating in and out of spaces in Brooklyn and New York City.
Mm. When we look at New York, and I'm looking at not just the radical tradition of women, but looking at what happens in New York and leaders in New York. If I had to make a comparison between the sort of Shirley Chisholm style, the politician I would think of, and you mentioned a reference in the introduction, Adam Clayton Powell.
Yes.
Like you are not going to tell me what to do. You know what I'm saying? You know.
She's the female version of Adam Clayton Powell, right? She literally, and there's no other example. When people say, oh, who is she like? There wasn't a roadmap for Shirley Chisholm, right? There weren't
Hmm.
any Black women who were operating on that scale. And the closest to the political ideology and the charisma, right? Is someone like Adam Clayton Powell. And she definitely, if you go to the exhibit in the city, you will see a her and Adam Clayton Powell. There are pictures as well as portraits of her and Adam Clayton Powell during a parade for the African American Day parade that they have in Harlem. So she definitely is someone who really appreciated Adam Clayton Powell, his perspective, as well as his ability to be unapologetic.
Hmm. You mentioned another person that comes to mind who sort of have this sort of definitely sense of power. Percy Sutton.
Yes. Well, Percy Sutton and Shirley Chisholm were in alliances together, right? They were in coalitions. They were in the New York State Assembly together. Percy
Hmm.
Sutton also introduces her when she gives her opening speech of declaring that she's running for the presidency in 72. So she has a really good relationship with Percy Sutton.
You know, that's interesting because you get that connection between Percy Sutton and Malcolm X. Because I
Yes,
think he was the person that was handling after Malcolm's assassination. He was very close to the family,
that's
so you
true.
have that interesting connection. You know, I want to talk about we talking about Adam Clay about the style. Could you talk about her as order? She had this rapid type of style, okay?
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
which I guess somebody could call back to Malcolm X, but then another person who sounds like that is Lorraine Hansberry.
Mm.
Lorraine has this talking, and how much is that a sense of black radicalism? You know, how much is it just New York? Is it Brooklyn? You know,
It's a combination of all of those things, right? As well as Barbados, right? Like this
and I
city,
hear it in your voice too.
I can't help it. And people are like, "Oh my gosh, my accent from, being from Brooklyn." But it's all of those things, right? And even in my own, I guess oration, it's the influence of, I mean, mine can fluctuate between South and, West Indian, but all of those kind of mixtures, and then also talking very fast. I have people who are like, "Okay, slow down. You talk so fast." And I'm like, "Oh, like that's just I never even think about it." So in some ways, that's the same thing for Chisholm. Chisholm is the cadence and thinking about her oratory skills. And that's why I tell people, and that's why we have in the exhibit, that it's one thing to read Chisholm, it's another thing to hear her. She is a lightning bolt. And I think that's also her studying of Malcolm. When you listen to Malcolm, it's different than reading Malcolm. And her ability to also engage questions. I mean, it's a master class that I took, with the late great Manning Marable, right?
Mm,
I worked with him a lot at Columbia. He was one of my mentors, and he would say, just study. You know what I
mm,
mean? Just study Malcolm. And I was a part of his first Malcolm class at Columbia.
mm,
And he was like, just study the way in which Malcolm answers questions, right? And it's something that, I and continue to be in awe at his inability to not really pay attention. I mean, he paid attention to the questions, but really transform his answers to do his own agenda and to speak to what he wanted to. And so I think Chisholm also had a certain kind of affinity towards Malcolm in particular.
mm.
And the way in which he operated and the political mind in which, and all of these things have an influence on Chisholm's oratory as well as intellectual understanding.
Let's talk about the look of Shirley Chisholm. You know, if I look at Shirley Chisholm, I said, Shirley Chisholm got that look like she could be like Aretha Franklin. You know, there's an era where you had Mahalia Jackson. You know, there was a thing where women hairdos was a certain way.
Yeah.
Whether wigs or whatever, but they crowns or whatever. But there's that was a look.
Hmm. Well, I
You
mean,
know,
I
so
talk a lot in my other book, my other manuscript that I'm finishing up, comparative study of Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan. I talk about the politics of style, right? I don't want to
mm.
give it all away. But
You don't know. You supposed to do like a movie trailer. You supposed to say,
I mean,
Ethelbert, I got another book coming out, and you got to do another show with me.
yes, yes. I mean, and as being the historical consultant on the film Shirley with Regina King and John Ridley, I mean, we talked a lot about her fashion, right? And they got it
Mm.
down packed. I mean, I brought Regina and John, they came to Brooklyn to our archive at the Shirley Chisholm Project, looking at pictures and looking at video and doing those
Well, let
kinds
me
of
ask you
things.
that. Did you have to? Did you tinker with the film and say like, okay, I see this, but you're getting this a little bit wrong, and let me make a correction here?
Well, yeah, I mean, I didn't even have to do it because I was a part of the film from the beginning,
I
right?
see.
From the beginning scripts. And so, yes, being the historical consultant on that film and working with participant and working with Netflix at the end, I had, I had, you know, conversations with Regina in the middle of the night, all of those kind of things. So it was very an intense and, um holistic kind of process. So and they really did get it right. And if you go to the
Mm-hmm.
exhibit, we have one of Chisholm's one of the outfits that Regina wears in the film, and it's a part of the exhibit in New York. But Chisholm doesn't go, like I say, she doesn't go into Congress wearing a black and a brown suit. As you see in my background, she's wearing vibrant prints, right? Vibrant colors. And so she's engaging. One of my favorite pictures of Shirley Chisholm is her on Jet magazine, with her hat tilted to the side, ajar, and her wearing her
A
fur,
jarred.
right? And her wearing her fur collar coat. She embodied the style of African and Caribbean women. She loved fashion. She loved looking a certain way, but she's also very different. So that's the other thing, right? It's a different look, especially in the 70s, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then some of the Black Panthers and the radicals. She's not coming out with an afro, but she's still radical even in her mink coat, right? Like she's still talking the business, but she has a different style aesthetic, and so she's not fully like Ella Baker with the church hat, but she is a part of that kind of, she embodies that New York style, um of African American women who believe like when you go out you dress.
Well, let me ask you this, because we could line up a number of black women running for office. We can just throw in Kamala Harris and say, okay, did she dress the part? Did she lose the election because she didn't dress a certain way? I mean, because you're sort of saying like, well, maybe I would have voted for her if she had a different look. Did she look like an AKA or a Delta? You know what I'm saying? That whole
well,
thing.
well, Shirley was a Delta, so
See,
yes, like I am. So I
see,
mean,
here we go. Here, this is confessional. You can't. I know there's a lot coming out in this interview here.
well, everyone know. I mean, most people know I'm a Delta. So, but yeah, I mean, Shirley Chisholm was a member of the Brooklyn alumni, of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. So, but no, I would say that Chisholm actually goes against the grain. It
Hmm.
actually, she doesn't. If we want to be honest, she actually does something different than Kamala does. In terms of, Kamala was wearing suits and wearing pantsuits and all of that. Chisholm was not change. She did not change her style because she was running for the presidency.
Hmm.
She doesn't conform to the dress that a number of people are conforming in the present day. And so while we think that the moment that we're in is the most progressive, I will say in some ways it's not, right? It's in some
Hmm.
ways it's regressive. Just even thinking about the ways in which we think about Michelle Obama. Like I love seeing her in braids now, but she would never.
After she
Yeah,
left the White House.
after she left the White House, right? So there is a way, but Chisholm, her style was consistent. And we have to understand that she is a trailblazer in that way. So when you go to the Capitol and see the picture of Shirley Chisholm, it's not of Shirley Chisholm in a black suit. It's of Shirley Chisholm in a geometric uh long, you know, dress that she wore, right? And I rarely ever saw Chisholm in pants, ironically. So she is abiding to a certain kind of aesthetic, but not to the aesthetic of the men. She's not wearing boxy suit. It's also very not similar to, for example, a Barbara Jordan who wore boxy
Hmm.
suits, who wore a little bit more conservative. She's also coming from Texas, so there's a different, thing there. But Chisholm is paying homage to the Caribbean with colors. She's not afraid of those things, and that's also
Hmm.
replicated in her own. her own policies, her own political ideology.
Okay, we're going to take a little break here. My guest today on the margin is Zinger A. Fraser. She is the editor of Shirley Chisholm in Her Own Words, Speeches, and Writings. The show is on the margin. My name is Ethelbert Miller. The station's WPFW 89.3 FM.
Peace. This is your social justice calendar for the week of January the 27th, 2025. On Thursday, January the 30th at 5:30 p.m., government representatives will be present to hear our voices about Amigos Park and respond to community concerns. This will take place at the Mount Pleasant Library, 3160 16th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. More information can be found at diversityfund.org. On Saturday, February 1st, from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m., the annual Know Thyself Book Fair and Authors Forum, sponsored by the UNIA ACL Woodson Banneker Jackson Bay Division 330, will take place at the Thurgood Marshall Center, 1816 12th Street, Northwest, Washington, D.C. Call 202-787-0251. Finally, on Saturday, February the 1st, the Papua Queen Healing Justice Forum will take place from 3 to 7:30 p.m. at the Creative Suitland Arts Center, 4719 Silver Hill Road, Hillcrest Heights. More information can be found on Eventbrite. The social justice calendar connects the community with grassroots activism. Submissions can be emailed to socialjustice@wpfw.org. Please include the name, date, and address of the event. Submissions are due Thursday at 5 p.m., at least 1 week in advance. The WPFW Social Justice Calendar is just one more way that WPFW uplifts our community, one broadcast at a time. Peace.
Okay, we're back on the margin with my guest, Zinger A. Fraser. She's the editor of Shirley Chisholm in Her Own Words, Speeches, and Writings. Zinger, let's talk about Shirley Chisholm's 1972 run for presidency. How well organized was that campaign? Who was in opposition to her running? And how did the media cover her?
So, in terms of the campaign, how it was organized, Chisholm is trying to find the best way to run with the limited amount of resources and money, right? And so her decision to run in specific places where she could receive the most delegates, right? So that's part of the strategy, is to make sure that she was able to capture or gain as many delegates as possible. So she didn't have a, you know, uh an entire, nationwide campaign where she campaigned in every state, right? She was strategic in saying that, okay, there.
Who was managing her campaign?
So there were, like, it's really a hodgepodge of those, and there were people who she did have an advisor, Wesley McColder, who's from New York City, who was an advisor. There were other, campaign workers. She did have like a campaign manager, but then they left in the middle of the campaign. So she didn't have like
Mm.
one central person. And a part of that was because she didn't have the money, she didn't have the resources, like someone like McGovern did, right? And so she had a hodgepodge of people who were working, whether they were in California or in North Carolina or Massachusetts. People would say, "Hey, we want to put you on the ballot here." And so then, she'd be like, "Okay, fine. You get the team together because I don't have the resources to outfit every state." And so even though the main headquarters was in, New York City, in Brooklyn, there were other states where other people took over. So that was at least a part of the strategy. Who's up against? She's up against, of course, all of the white men who were running. And the ticket was flooded by people like McGovern and George Wallace and, Lindsay. There were so many people who were running. By the time of the convention, a significant portion of them had, decided not to go through with their own campaigns. And, Chisholm does an excellent job for being African American, being the first woman, and going and making it to convention. I tell people all the time, you know, only until 2024 had another Black woman made it to convention. When Kamala runs prior to that, she doesn't even make it to the convention, right?
Mhm.
Everyone pulls out before they make it to convention. But Chisholm made it to the convention in 72. And that's a tremendous feat. Just think about all of that time from 72 to 24. That time period, that span, no one was able to make it to convention. And so in terms of the coverage, I mean, Chisholm even had to fight to ensure that there was coverage, that she was treated the same ways in which the men that she was running up against. They refused to have her on Meet the Press, and she, formed a lawsuit action saying that she deserves, as Maxine Waters would say, give me my time, right? And so it was an uphill battle to be heard, to be engaged. Not only, the media would, of course, engage her in some ways because they were enamored that they had a Black woman who was running in 72. And so some of that allowed her to have coverage, but also there was, of course, intense misogyny and sexism and racism, and the combination of all of those.
Well, talk about perhaps in some sense the lack of support from some Black elected officials.
Yes. Well, I mean, Chisholm, the idea that it was that she was crazy, and she wasn't only seen as crazy by the white media, right? And her white colleagues. She was seen crazy by some of her Black colleagues. A lot of the Black elected officials, a significant portion of the Congressional Black Caucus did not support her.
Mhm.
And in part, there's always also this kind of misconception that Black men didn't support Shirley Chisholm. Yes, there were a significant portion of Black elected officials that did not support Shirley Chisholm. But in terms of the grassroots organizers and engagers and some of the activists who were really prevalent during that time, they did have a support system for Shirley Chisholm. Not only, when we talk about the Black Panthers, but other kind of grassroots organizers who really believed in what Shirley Chisholm was
Okay,
trying
let
to
me let me ask you a tough question here. Okay, you provided you talked about how you were helped with the film on
do.
Shirley Chisholm. You were like a consultant. So let's make you a consultant to the Kamala Harris campaign. What would you say? Okay, what's going right? What did you do wrong? I mean, if you're looking at it in terms of just based on the knowledge that you know of Shirley Chisholm, what she had to do you suggest certain things in like in September or October before people vote that okay, this is what you need to do?
I mean, there's so many things that you need to do, right? It's hard to say what was done wrong. I think what was done right and what she learned. Maybe this is a better way. And it's not that it's difficult, right? But what I think Kamala learned, and she did, I will say that the campaign contacted me about speeches of Shirley Chisholm. The thing that I discuss at times is that at least she leans in to Shirley Chisholm. I said this when Hillary Clinton was running, the inability, and I received letters from Hillary and her staff, the inability, because I was in the New York Times, saying that she didn't lean in to saying that there was a Shirley Chisholm. She didn't mention Shirley Chisholm when she runs. Neither does
Hmm.
Barack Obama for that instance either.
Right.
Right. And all of these people are a part of Chisholm's legacy. The one thing that
Well,
Kamala,
how much did Jesse Jackson mention Shirley Chisholm when he was
he
running in
doesn't
'84?
mention Shirley Chisholm, but Shirley Chisholm actually helps campaign. She
Mm-hmm.
she makes a number of steps, and Shirley Chisholm and Jesse Jackson, and I've interviewed briefly, Jesse Jackson, had a really good relationship. So Chisholm does provide that, what I consider, what Robin Kelly, DG Kelly calls as a freedom dream, right? She provides a certain kind of freedom dream for Jesse Jackson. The coalition that Chisholm is trying to pull together in 72 is the same coalition of the Rainbow Coalition. They actually call Chisholm's 72 campaign in some spaces the Rainbow Coalition, right? So all of those things are influences. But I say Hillary and Barack Obama in terms of the contemporary thing, right? Harris leans into that. She knows that she is standing on the shoulders of Shirley Chisholm more than anyone else, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, and in empowering Black women, the consistent, you asked me about the constituencies, but the constituencies that were the most consistent for Shirley Chisholm, whether it be locally or nationally, was Black women. Chisholm understood infinitely before anyone could say now Black women are the base of the party. Chisholm knew they were the base of the party in 72. She
Well,
knew.
when you look at 72, and maybe this ties into what you're saying about she knew about the importance of women, there is this emphasis in her campaign focusing on the issue of housing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, she's focusing on everything, right? She's even telling white feminists what's wrong with you in terms of throwing away your vote when you're not making McGovern be responsible for reproductive justice, abortion. It's, and what that looks like. And so she's saying if you're for sisterhood, right? And we're
Mhm.
all women and hear me roar, then you would support Shirley Chisholm unilaterally. And some of them did not, right? But Black women, people like Barbara Lee and Florence Kennedy and others, were saying, this is the person. We're feminists. And they're part of those other groups, especially Flo Kennedy. She's telling, you know, Betty Friedan, how are you not a delegate for Shirley Chisholm? You have to be if you're saying you are a feminist and you're participating in the Democratic Party.
Mhm. Do you think it's this, and this is one of those questions that appears on the op-ed peeps after the election. Do you think the country is ready to elect a black woman president? I mean,
Obviously not. The country, we have the administration that a significant portion of white men and white women what they want. That's the truth. We are in the position, in particular, when people say, how can you be a feminist and still vote for the person who's the occupant? Because now I'm going back to not naming him.
mhm.
That's what I had to do, 4 years ago, when he was there previously, right? That you there is a segment of white women, not all, but a
Mhm.
significant portion of white women who are invested in white supremacy and who are invested in misogyny and sexism.
When you say that, that's interesting because if you look at the number of white women who have been assigned to positions within this administration, it's significant.
Well, being assigned to positions versus being um a recipient
I'm
of,
talking about cabinet positions.
yeah,
Hmm.
I mean, yes, there are, but the point of it is that those white women are invested in ensuring that the majority of women uh, don't receive the benefits and opportunities that women should receive, right? So they're when we talk about DEI, the people who really benefited from DEI are white women. The people who benefited from affirmative action are who? White women. So that's going against their best interest, right? But because of the fear of the browning of this country, they are uh, hit in caboodle under a oligarch who doesn't necessarily believe in having representation of all people.
Mm. Let's talk about something that's in your book. We're looking at Shirley Chisholm around 1982, and this is when Reagan's in office. You have a speech dealing with U.S. policy and black refugees.
Hmm.
Talk about that because that seems extremely timely,
Hmm.
and very important.
Well, I mean, Chisholm, her district had, and even till today, that district has a large population of Haitian refugees, right? And Haitian immigrants. And so Chisholm is looking at the immigration policy of Reagan and really being very frank, is saying that it was indeed a racist policy that would allow Cuban, and in particular white Cubans, to come to this country and be seen as refugees, and with a certain kind of level of respect and care and empathy. However, when it came to Haitian refugees, the ways in which the policies were administrated, how they were perceived by the government, was not favorable to them or respectful. And so she calls out these kind of discrepancies in immigration policy during that time, under the Reagan administration.
Hmm. Talk about we began our program talking about the Garvey connection. Um, what was Shirley Chisholm's views about Africa?
I mean, she believed Africa was a an important part of thinking about the influence of colonialism, thinking about the influence of imperialism, and the ways in which they have been cut out of the economic and global markets. She's thinking about Africa in terms of its, of course, rich history and the importance of teaching, even when we're talking about today, the importance of teaching African history, African American history. So she has that kind of perspective. She's really invested and engaged in thinking about uh, Africa and the global market, and talking about some of also the economic issues. So the work of people like Mickey Leland, right? Or
Mm,
someone like Randall Robinson, or even, the congressman from New Jersey, Payne, who was really advocate for Africa and TransUnion, and thinking about the ways in which people could collaborate. Were all kind of influences of Garvey, but also
hmm
a lot of the activists like Alumbe Brath and Kwasi, um, G2 Quasi in Brooklyn, who were also, about talking about this kind of global. I think what people fail to remember is that you have so many activists during the 70s and the 80s who are really talking about engaging Africa in a different way,
hmm
and invested in that enterprise.
Right. Let's talk about your book, Zinga Fraser, Shirley Chisholm in Her Own Words, Speeches and Writing, because I was curious about. I mean, how many poems did she write? I mean, you include one in the book,
Yeah,
but
there are not that many. There are about maybe what I could find. So there
hmm
may be somewhere. Lord knows there may be others. But I think there are about like 5 to 6. We couldn't get clearance for some of the other ones, so I
hmm
was only able to do one. But she loved poets. She loved
hmm
music. She loved, the piano. She could play the piano as well. So she also had a very kind of artistic connection to the word.
Talk about how you conceptualize this book. Were there speeches that you had to transcribe? That was, were there speeches that you discovered or articles that you discovered that you didn't know she had written? Just how did you put together and how long did it take you to put this book together?
Well, it's in the midst of COVID. And so prior to COVID, I had the idea for the book. And part of the reason why I conceptualized the book was because, as an academic who loves to be in the archive, um, I realized that I couldn't go to the archive during COVID.
Mm,
The libraries were closed. And so it was like, what other thing could I produce or create? And I was also with my pregnant with my son. So thinking about the ways in which I could, navigate certain things. So that was the onus of, you take a lemon, get lemonade. Um, and so in terms of the structure of the book, I really wanted, I knew very well because I was working on this other book, The Breath of Shirley Chisholm. And what really intrigued me was the lack of understanding that people had about Chisholm. And not through their own, not through a writer's gaze, but what she said. And
Right.
I was really tired of seeing people write things that had no idea about Chisholm, right? And I was like, but if you read her speeches, if you understood what she said, then you would really know who she was. And I wanted to give it as a resource, as a teacher who teaches students every year, right? Um, I have a fascination with primary documents. I
Mm.
force students to actually go into the library. It exists,
Right.
right? um, um, to see what a primary document looks like because they have no idea. Everything is not on Wikipedia, and the stuff that's on Wikipedia is
May
wrong.
not be correct. Right.
Right, exactly. So I wanted people to have Chisholm for who she was and what she said. Not,
Hmm.
yes, I give an introduction, but I wanted to give the primary sources to individuals, whether they be a student or they're just interested in knowing. And I wanted to show the breadth of Shirley Chisholm's intellectual understandings. And so that's why it's divided up in all of those areas.
Talk about the exhibit that's at the Museum of the City of New York, Changing the Face of Democracy, Shirley Chisholm at 100. Talk briefly about that.
So the exhibit is something that I never imagined, right? As a co-curator of the first museum exhibition for Shirley Chisholm solely is was indeed an honor. And it provides all of the ways in which we can reimagine Shirley Chisholm, everything from her upbringings to what her legacy looks like. It's interactive, where students can, go and touch and listen to Shirley Chisholm's speeches. You can see Shirley Chisholm's fashion. You can see the West Indian,
All the things we've been discussing on this
yes,
show,
right? The
right?
West Indian Day Parade. You can actually vote. We have a voting booth where people can actually,
Hmm.
from New York City, what it would be like to be in the voting booth to vote for Shirley Chisholm. So it's an
Okay,
interactive.
I'm gonna have to stop. Right. Okay, I'm gonna have to stop you right there, Zinger, Fraser. But I want to ask you this last question, and then go out on this. Do you consider Shirley Chisholm a catalyst for change?
Yes, I do.
Why?
Because she transforms who should be at the top of the ticket. She transforms how people see themselves in an engagement in democracy. And so, because of that, she was a catalyst for change.
And because of you, Zinga Fraser, we know who Shirley Chisholm is. Okay. My guest today has been Zinga Fraser. She's the editor of Shirley Chisholm in her own words, speeches, and writing. She is also assistant professor of Africana Studies and Women's and Gender Studies at Brooklyn College and director of the Shirley Chisholm Project on Brooklyn Women Activism. The show's On the Margin. My name is Ethelbert Miller. The station's WPFW 89.3 FM.